April 16th, 1945. The storm approaches. The gray dawn over the Pacific Ocean was deceptively calm, the light winds rippling the surface in small, steady waves. Aboard the USS Laffey DD-724, sailors went about their duties with quiet vigilance. Positioned off Okinawa as part of the critical radar picket line, the destroyer was a lone sentinel, scanning the skies and seas for any signs of enemy activity. For days, the kamikaze attacks had grown more frequent, more desperate, and everyone aboard knew that the enemy was willing to die in order to strike a blow against the American fleet. Below decks, in the cramped, humming radar room, a young operator leaned intently over his screen, eyes darting nervously as he searched for anomalies. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat. The radar screen, moments before largely empty except for the gentle arcs of friendly vessels farther south, began to fill with ominous specks, each representing a fast-approaching aircraft. They were coming in from the north, a swarm, too many to count at a glance. The operator's hand shot to the 1MC microphone, his voice breaking as he shouted the dreaded warning across the ship. "Air raid! Multiple bogies inbound. Estimate 50 bandits." Throughout the vessel, the klaxon alarms screamed to life, and sailors raced to their battle stations with grim efficiency. They had trained for this moment for months, but training could only do so much to steel a man for the reality of what was now upon them. On the bridge, Captain Frederick Julian Beckton, a battle-hardened veteran of the Normandy landings, assessed the situation instantly. He didn't need to be told that this was no ordinary raid. The sheer number of incoming enemy aircraft, their speed, their formation, it all pointed to a coordinated, massive kamikaze assault. His voice, calm but firm, rang out. "This isn't just an attack, it's an annihilation attempt." Beckton knew the role his ship played. Station number 1 was the northernmost radar picket station off Okinawa, the very tip of the spear, and thus the first line of defense against incoming air attacks. Their mission was vital but brutal: to detect enemy planes early, warn the fleet behind them, and, if necessary, absorb the initial wave of violence. Positioned miles from the nearest support, the Laffey was effectively alone, a solitary shield between the Japanese onslaught and the vulnerable American landing forces. The deck crews scrambled to ready the ship's considerable anti-aircraft arsenal. The twin 5-inch guns were already manned, their long barrels swinging skyward. Crews armed the 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons, loading belts of ammunition and setting fuses as officers barked last-second orders. Smoke generators were prepared, damage control teams double-checked their equipment, and medical corpsmen braced for casualties. Above them, the sky remained deceptively clear, for now. But the tension was thick enough to choke on. Every man aboard the Laffey understood the stakes. There would be no reinforcement in time, no fighter cover until much later. They would have to stand and fight alone. Captain Beckton moved methodically, ensuring his orders were understood. He trusted his officers, trusted his gunners, but he knew that no amount of discipline could completely prepare a crew for the hell that was about to descend upon them. The kamikaze pilots were not like any other enemy. They would not break off their attack if faced with heavy fire. They would not retreat if wounded. They would press home their strike even if their plane was on fire, even if they themselves were dying. Their sole mission was to crash into an American ship and destroy it, at the cost of their own lives. Through binoculars, the first specks became visible on the northern horizon. Tiny dark shapes at first, growing larger by the second, twisting and darting as they maneuvered for attack runs. Zeros, Judys, Vals, all types of Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft, their undersides glinting in the morning sun, their pilots determined to complete their final mission. The air around the Laffey began to crackle with tension. Already, the ship's radar plot was cluttered with so many contacts, it was nearly impossible to track them all individually. The Combat Information Center relayed updated bearings and ranges to the gun crews, who braced themselves to open fire at extreme range. The first salvo erupted from the destroyer's guns, and the battle for survival had begun. This was no mere skirmish. It was the beginning of the largest concentrated kamikaze attack ever launched against a single ship in naval history. Before the day was out, dozens of enemy aircraft would throw themselves at the Laffey, slashing down from the skies with an almost suicidal determination. Fires would rage, hull plates would buckle, men would bleed, and some would die. But in this moment, in this quiet breath before the storm, every man aboard understood. His duty with crystalline clarity. USS Laffey was not just another destroyer on picket duty. She was now the only thing standing between a massive enemy air armada and the vulnerable American fleet behind her. She would have to hold or die trying. And so, as the first wave of kamikazes plunged out of the sky like shrieking demons, the men of the Laffey steeled themselves for the fight of their lives. They would soon prove why the USS Laffey would forever be remembered as the ship that would not die. The ship that wouldn't die. USS Laffey's vital stats, familiar to older naval enthusiasts. She was a Sumner-class destroyer, displacing around 2,200 tons and bristled with firepower. 6 powerful 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns formed her main battery, capable of hammering enemy planes out of the sky or blasting hostile surface vessels. 12 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns, arranged in quad mounts, provided a vicious wall of fire at medium range, while 11 rapid-firing 20mm Oerlikon cannons covered close-in threats. The ship's heartbeat was her crew, 336 officers and enlisted men, the average sailor no older than 19, barely out of boyhood, now standing at the gates of hell itself. Her nickname, the ship that wouldn't die, had been spoken in admiration even before April 16, 1945. But what was about to happen that day off Okinawa would carve that name into history, not with words, but with blood and fire and unbending steel. First wave, 8:30 a.m. The divine wind strikes. As the clock struck 8:30 a.m., the distant roar of aircraft engines filled the air, growing louder with each heartbeat. Out of the blinding morning sun, the first wave came, 24 Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers. They approached in 3-plane V-shaped formations, textbook precision masking the deadly individual intent of each pilot. Gunner's mate Paul Buddy Costin later recalled with chilling clarity, "They came in low from the sun, and you could see the pilots' faces as they lined up their runs. You could see the goggles, the scarves fluttering. They weren't turning away. They were coming straight at us." The opening minutes. At 8:32 a.m., chaos erupted. The first kamikaze struck the ship near the starboard side 20mm gun tub. In an instant, the exposed gunners were wiped out, their bodies flung like rag dolls across the blood-slicked deck. The flames ignited ready-use ammunition lockers, sending orange and black plumes curling skyward. Barely 2 minutes later, at 8:34 a.m., 2 more Japanese aircraft executed near-simultaneous suicide dives into the Laffey's aft section. The deckhouse, the proud structure that had stood firm against the sea and storm for months, was reduced to a shattered wreckage of splintered steel and burning timber. Entire gun crews vanished, obliterated where they stood. The ship shuddered under the assault, groaning like a living thing in agony, but Captain Beckton and his officers refused to yield an inch. Smoke, fire, and the stench of burning fuel filled the air, but the surviving gunners kept firing, their hands blistered and faces blackened with soot. At 8:37 a.m., another terrible blow landed. A bomb-carrying Judy, riddled with shrapnel but not deflected from its deadly course, smashed into Mount 52, one of Laffey's rear gun positions. The explosion ripped through the ship's guts, penetrating deep into the internal compartments. In that horrific moment, 14 men, young sailors with futures yet unlived, were vaporized instantly, their bodies consumed by the fireball. Below decks, the situation was critical. Flooding began in multiple compartments as piping systems ruptured. Fires raged across 3 levels of the destroyer, fed by aviation fuel and exploding munitions. The engineers fought waist-deep in oily water to keep the ship's engines alive. They knew that if Laffey lost propulsion, she would be a sitting duck for the kamikaze waves that continued to come. Damage Control Officer Lieutenant Frank Manson, already bloodied from debris, delivered a situation report that would have broken lesser men. We had fires on 3 levels, flooded compartments, and still 40-plus planes inbound. The grim reality was setting in. Laffey had already suffered more hits in 10 minutes than many destroyers took during an entire engagement, and yet the battle had barely begun. The radar picket station they defended so fiercely had become a flaming altar of sacrifice, and the kamikazes showed no sign of relenting. Above them, the skies boiled with more enemy aircraft, circling, diving, aiming to crash into the crippled ship. On deck, sailors wrestled wounded comrades away from burning gun mounts, threw ammunition overboard to prevent secondary explosions, and fought fires with hoses, sand, and bare hands when necessary. Every man aboard understood. If they faltered for even a moment, the Laffey would die. But somehow, through smoke-blurred eyes and bloodied hands, they fought on. USS Laffey, the ship that wouldn't die, was, earning her name, second by desperate second, against impossible odds. The gun crews that stood their ground. As the brutal attack intensified, the crew of USS Laffey transformed from sailors into legends. Individual acts of courage and sacrifice flared across the battered decks, each one a defiant answer to death itself. They would not yield. They would not abandon their ship. Even as fire and steel rained down, they held their ground, fighting with a fury that stunned even seasoned officers. Mount 53's last stand. At the stern, Mount 53, one of Laffey's 5-inch gun turrets, became a fiery fortress. Surrounded by raging flames, choking smoke, and twisted wreckage, the gun crew refused to fall back. Seaman Jack "Lucky" Simpson, the loader from Mount 53, was seen heaving shells into the breach with superhuman effort, even as debris pelted him from above. In a moment burned into the memory of those who survived. A shard of shrapnel sliced through the air, severing Simpson's right arm clean at the elbow. Blood fountained from the wound, but incredibly, Simpson didn't collapse. He braced himself against the mount with his remaining strength, urging his shipmates to continue. His blood pooled at his feet, mixing with seawater and oil, but his spirit refused to break. Chief Petty Officer William Bull Harris, gun captain of Mount 53, stood resolute amid the inferno. Flames licked at his uniform, burning through fabric and scorching his skin. Pain-racked but undeterred, Harris roared over the din of battle. "Keep shooting!" And they did. Shell after shell, the battered crew fired into the diving planes, holding back the tide with stubborn courage and steel determination. The Bofors quad that wouldn't quit forward of Mount 53, a 40mm Bofors quad mount, fought its own desperate battle. The gunners, grim-faced and sweat-drenched, raked the skies with overlapping curtains of tracer fire. They shot down 5 enemy planes in less than 8 minutes, a blistering feat of marksmanship under hellish conditions. But victory had a price. A direct hit from a kamikaze shattered the mount, killing or maiming many of the gun crew. Yet the survivors, refusing to abandon their post, passed heavy 40mm rounds hand-to-hand from the wreckage of the destroyed mount, feeding the remaining barrels to keep up the defensive barrage. It was desperate, savage work. Every round they fired meant another plane possibly knocked from the sky, another chance for their brothers in arms to live a few seconds longer. Radarman James Doc Rutter, stationed near the battered superstructure, later described the chaos unfolding around him. Our 20-millimeter gunners were shooting at planes already on fire, trying to knock them down before they hit us. You didn't wait to see if they were falling. You just kept firing until there was nothing left to shoot. The critical 10 minutes, 8:50 to 9 a.m. This 10-minute stretch between 8:50 and 9 a.m. would go down as one of the most savage and desperate battles a single ship ever faced. In just that brief span, the USS Laffey endured a sustained beating almost beyond imagination. 6 direct kamikaze impacts, each plane a manned missile of fire and steel. 4 bomb hits, some punching deep into her armored decks, setting fires that raged out of control. 2 near misses that, while they failed to strike the ship directly, exploded close enough to tear open hull plates and flood compartments. Below decks, Engineering Officer Lieutenant J.G. Ralph Jones and his beleaguered team fought an equally critical battle, waged not with guns, but with tools, pumps, and iron will. Every time we patched a steam line, Jones recounted grimly, another plane would hit and rip it open again. They worked in darkness and scalding heat, breathing foul air thick with smoke, fighting to maintain steam pressure that kept Laffey moving and alive. On the bridge, Captain Becton refused to abandon ship or order the crew to cease firing, no matter the carnage. His simple, unwavering command carried through the shattered vessel. We'll stay and fight it out. The turning point, 9:15 a.m. Just when it seemed the end was inevitable, when ammunition was running dangerously low, hoses were bursting under the strain, and wounded men outnumbered the healthy on many decks, salvation arrived. At 9:15 a.m., F-4U Corsair fighter planes from the carrier USS Shangri-La roared in over the horizon. Their radial engines thundered like a divine chorus, and within seconds they began carving into the mass of kamikazes with cannons and rockets. Almost simultaneously, the destroyer USS Sigsbee, herself battered but still defiant, steamed into firing range to lend her guns to Laffey's defense. The combined firepower turned the skies into a maelstrom of tracers and falling wreckage. The last kamikaze, a sleek and deadly Ki-84 Frank, dived in at suicidal speed, aiming to finish the job. Every remaining gun aboard Laffey opened up. Tracers stitched the sky. The Corsairs screamed in behind it, adding their own deadly punctuation. The Ki-84 exploded in a blinding fireball just 50 yards off the port bow, sending up a geyser of foam and twisted wreckage, but the ship herself remained afloat. By 9:50 a.m., the skies finally cleared. The ocean around Laffey was littered with oil slicks, floating wreckage, and the lifeless bodies of enemy pilots. Smoke billowed from dozens of fires still burning aboard. The final tally was grim but awe-inspiring. 22 kamikazes destroyed, 6 by Laffey's own battered guns. 32 attackers either driven off or obliterated by the combined air and sea defense. 4 bomb hits, 6 kamikaze strikes directly to the hull. Casualties among the crew, 32 men killed, 71 wounded, many critically. And yet, against every law of probability and logic, USS Laffey refused to sink. Her decks were scorched, her hull pierced, her crew bloodied. But her flag still flew, and her guns, battered though they were, stood ready. Aftermath: a ship barely afloat. The battered hulk that remained of USS Laffey was a study in impossible survival. When the smoke cleared and the last fires were beaten back, what remained was a destroyer so ravaged by war that even seasoned sailors found it hard to believe she was still afloat. The damage defied logic, defied seamanship, and defied history itself. All after guns destroyed. Once bristling with deadly firepower, Laffey's rear batteries were now silent, twisted wrecks. Charred barrels drooped at unnatural angles, scorched by heat so intense it had melted steel plating around them. 80% of her superstructure burned out. The proud bridge, radar masts, gun mounts, and crew quarters had been reduced to blackened skeletons. Lifeboats hung shattered and useless, rigging dripped molten slag, and the entire upper deck looked as if a giant fist had crushed it. 3 compartments flooded. Below decks, seawater sloshed freely through compartments once alive with the hum of machinery and the shouts of crewmen. Damage control teams fought a desperate foot-by-foot battle to keep her afloat, plugging leaks with mattresses, canvas, and even the bodies of fallen shipmates when necessary. Steering by hand pumps. The mechanical steering gear, riddled with shrapnel and warped by blast waves, was dead. Instead, exhausted sailors manned primitive hand pumps and chains in the steaming, smoke-choked guts of the ship, manually swinging the rudder in response to shouted commands relayed from the battered bridge. And yet, impossibly, the USS Laffey did not sink. She did not drift helplessly. She steamed into Karama under her own power. Black smoke trailing behind her like a battle flag, decks awash with blood and oil, Laffey limped into the sheltered anchorage. Her crew, dazed, bloody, burned but unbroken, stood at their stations. Some saluted, some wept openly. Most simply stared ahead, unwilling to show weakness until their ship was safely at anchor. When Admiral Raymond Spruance, architect of victories at Midway and the Philippine Sea, came aboard to inspect the damage, even he was visibly shaken. He grasped Captain Frederick Beckton's soot-blackened hand and said simply, "I'm recommending your entire crew for unit citations. No ship has ever survived anything like this." And that was no exaggeration. In the long, bloody history of naval warfare, no single destroyer had ever endured such a concentrated, sustained, and overwhelming assault, and lived to tell the tale. Why this resonates with older audiences. The human element. There is something deeply human about the story of USS Laffey, something that speaks to anyone who has ever worn a uniform, hoisted a flag, or loved someone who did. Many of her crew were little more than boys, barely out of high school. The average age aboard was just 19 years old. The youngest casualty that day was a 17-year-old seaman, still carrying a photo of his sweetheart in his breast pocket when he fell. Survivors from that harrowing day kept their bond alive for decades. Their reunions, filled with tears, laughter, and stories both haunting and hilarious, continued into the 2010s, long after the last gun had fired and the last kamikaze had fallen. The technical appreciation. Your viewers, men and women who remember when destroyers were called tin cans, appreciate the brutal technical realities. They understand what it meant to operate a Sumner-class destroyer, the 5-inch 38 caliber guns that spat fire at 22 rounds per minute, the Bofors quad mounts that stitched death into the sky, and the brave sailors who reloaded, aimed, and fired under conditions that few modern navies can even imagine. They remember when ships were built from riveted steel, not computers, and when survival depended not on technology, but on grit, skill, and brotherhood. Historical significance. Laffey's stand wasn't just an isolated act of bravery, it was a pivotal moment in history. It marked the last major kamikaze threat before the fall of Okinawa, clearing the way for the final assaults on Japan. It also laid bare the deadly reality of radar picket duty, ships stationed far from the main fleet, often isolated, lightly supported, were prime targets for massed suicide attacks. Serving on picket duty meant accepting the near certainty of death. And yet, Laffey's crew volunteered, fought, and triumphed. The legacy lives on today. The USS Laffey is preserved at Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. She bears her scars with pride. Her twisted steel, buckled decks, and silent guns speak louder than any plaque or museum exhibit ever could. Visitors walk her decks. Older men leaning heavily on canes, grandchildren wide-eyed and curious. And they feel the weight of history pressing in. At one reunion event, 98-year-old survivor Calvin Clower summed it up best in a trembling voice that carried across the silent deck. "We weren't heroes. We were just kids who refused to let our ship die." And in that simple, humble truth lies the enduring power of USS Laffey's story.